Tonight at 7, the U.S. Supreme Court is adopting a code of conduct. It's a statement that the justices say the policy is an attempt to improve public confidence in the high court. This comes after months of headlines alleging some justices appear to have potential ethics violations. But how effective will this policy be? Let's bring in Deborah Beim, an assistant political science professor at the University of Michigan. All right, Deborah, could you just walk us through what does a code of conduct look like for a Supreme Court justice?
Sure. So the code of conduct that the court wrote out is really, as far as they tell us, them just codifying and explaining to us rules and principles that they were already following to guide their behavior. And it's built from all sorts of other pieces that they sort of found out there in the world. So it's inspired in large part by a code of conduct that the courts of appeals judges have to follow. And it just sort of delineates best practices. Be impartial, don't get embroiled in politics, disclose anything that might be worth disclosing, those kinds of things.
Is this something that will lead to actual changes, or do you think it's a move just to look like they want to make changes?
Neither. So I don't think they want to look like they're making changes. They were pretty explicit in saying, we have already been following these principles, but many people out there seem to think that we're not following any kind of ethics code. So let us just reassure you, we always have been following these ethics principles. But I also don't think the goal is to change behavior. I know that there have been a lot of really sort of splashy and newsworthy ethics concerns coming out of the Supreme Court. And I am not sure that this ethics code or this code of conduct is meant to prevent those kinds of things from happening. It's meant to communicate to the public, we are in fact ethical. We do hold ourselves to the same standards as any other judge.
You know, the public opinion has been critical of the court. Do you think something like this has the power to actually sway public opinion?
Public opinion has been increasingly critical of the court. So public opinion about the court is a really hard thing to understand. Because when we ask individuals, like, do you think a particular institution in government is ethical? They very often say no. People do not think that Congress as a whole is particularly ethical, but their responses about the Supreme Court, even after all of these ethics violations, were pretty positive that the Supreme Court was not that unethical as compared to their responses about Congress. That said, there's a pretty big partisan divide. So when we ask respondents who identify as Democrats, they're far more likely recently to say that they think the Supreme Court is unethical. When we ask respondents who identify as Republicans, they're far more likely to say that the Supreme Court is ethical and they're happy with how they're behaving in sort of an ethical manner. So given that partisan split, do I think that this code of conduct is going to help Democrats feel that they should approve of the Supreme Court? No, I don't think that this is going to address the concerns that Democrats really have. On the other hand, I think the concerns that people have been expressing are a little bit hard to articulate into policy change. They kind of want judges to just be more ethical and responsible, but they also just want to trust the court more, and they don't know exactly what would help them do that. They just know they're not particularly happy with what the court is doing. And I don't think this will make a big difference in that. It may make Congress feel like we can tell our constituents, look, we don't have to take as much action because the court did this themselves. It may do that, but I don't think it's going to help respondents to surveys actually feel any different. I don't think it's going to help Americans feel any differently.
Do you think the criticism that the courts are facing now is different than criticism in the past, or is this something that always happens, it ebbs and flows, the public's opinion on the court, or is now different?
In my opinion, it just kind of ebbs and flows, and this is not a particular aberration. But that's an opinion, and there are plenty of people out there who think, no, something fundamental has changed. It used to be that we all were a little bit more on board with what the court was doing, and we were all a little bit more on the same page. I mean, we do live in an increasingly polarized country, and that is being reflected in the Supreme Court. And I think some of this, as I said, about the partisan split and these feelings about ethics violations, I think some of this is all tied in with that. We just feel a little bit more divided, and we have often in the past turned to the court to be like a stalwart and leader of the whole country, sort of undivided along political lines. But my personal opinion is that these kinds of feelings that the Supreme Court is really not on our side and that the Supreme Court is not behaving ethically and that they're being involved in things they shouldn't be, that this has been around since the Supreme Court has been around. And this is not a particularly new page in American history.
Okay, and I know you mentioned this isn't really about changing any actions, but is there a way that this code of conduct can be enforced? Will we be seeing changes in how the justices interact with political donors or manage their cases?
No, there isn't any kind of enforcement mechanism. There isn't any way for a party before the court who feels that the court has violated this to file any kind of a complaint. It is not a system of laws. It's just an articulation of what they say they have already been doing. So no, unfortunately, it's not any kind of like, here's a guideline for what you should do if you think we have done something wrong, or this is the committee you turn to. There's nothing like that.
All right, thank you so much for your insight. That's Deborah Beim, an assistant political professor at the University of Michigan. Thank you again for joining us tonight.
You're welcome. Pleasure to be here. Thank you.